Thank you for coming to listen to my talk tonight. Voice Tech, Everything You Know Is Wrong, a very ambitious title, but a distillation of some thoughts and facts from the voice industry over the last 8 or so years that I've worked in it. Hopefully make you think some things and ask me some questions afterwards. What I might ask you to do is mute any smart speakers while I talk. I don't want to trigger you buying or hearing or seeing anything you shouldn't do in the next 20 minutes or so. So while you do that, very quick introductions. My name is David. I've worked in the voice industry for many years, Amazon, Skyscanner, BBC and others, but tonight I'm here to represent Waracle, the UK's leading voice, web, mobile and emerging tech company. We are doing some great work across all sectors with many brands that you see on the screen here. And inevitably we are hiring, so we'd be delighted to hear from you if you are interested. Sales pitch over and let's move on. Myth 1, which applies to anything in software development really, but particularly to this: build it and they'll come, except they won't. And that's largely because people tend to think, because they've been instructed to by the evangelism over the years, which I used to take part in myself, that you build skills and then almost worry about what they do afterwards. It's put across that it's really easy to make a voice service, be it for Alexa, for Google, for any platform really, without thinking about the outcomes from them and the adoption and the engagement. Now, what happens because of that is you end up with 100,000 voice apps giving you cat facts and, frankly, sadly, farts. The successful ones don't think that way. The most successful ones are carefully developed products, often made by designers, UX experts and linguists who've come to this market really as the experts in what to do, because they've got a real grasp of the principles behind how to make something useful before you even think about the underlying tech and the limitations of it. Voice apps are designed, as I always say, not architected, and that's not something you hear much in the world of AWS, and many, indeed most, wouldn't exist if they'd been better with their research at the start. That's because voice tech actually moves fairly slowly for something that's seen as a rapid, disruptive new paradigm. It's not really like that. It's taken the best part of 50 years to get from saying some numbers to a phone so it dials for you, to being a calculator and other things, reading paragraphs of books to get drag and dictate to work, which some of you will have done. We're at the 95%-ish point, and you could have heard this presentation in 2017 and heard pretty much the same thing, that the last hard 5% is still on the way. But it's hard to get to because of things like background noise and microphones. I may be interrupted by a chainsaw today giving you this talk, for example, and things that just get in the way. And that last 5% makes it really hard for a voice service to do its job, and it's going to take years for that last 5% to be overcome. And that's manifested in how things are understood by these services. So fairly benign phrases don't really have any understanding behind them. So how's my balance? I'm on a course. We saw her duck. I'm going for miles. You can see yourself how there are multiple interpretations of these fairly simple phrases that could make them mean something completely different. And that's when you start to realise, when you get into the design, not the architecture of these things, that what you're seeking to do is figure out what people actually mean when they say something to you. When we say things to each other, as I'm doing now, the phrases are in my head. I have the benefit of slides to illustrate, but for most times speaking to people, you know what you're trying to convey, the context of it and the nature of it. When you're just giving a machine some audio and ultimately some text to deal with, it doesn't know necessarily why that's being said. The phrases must carry an intent, and then you've got a route from that intent to execute the response to it or carry on a conversation because of it. And that's the hard thing to do. And sometimes even within these phrases, there are words that carry different meanings, which are not always easy to spot and not always easy to define. And most platforms that carry conversation or voice depend on this critical work to design phrases where you elicit the intent from someone even after the words have been understood. And that's where this gets really difficult. And you only get the intent for each phrase and the entities which match it if you train users to say them and catalogue and retrain the system to understand more of them. And then that leads itself to the myth that assistants can do anything, and indeed everything. So if you think you're using potentially an Amazon, Google, Apple voice device, Samsung, they may carry 100,000 services, skills, apps, call them what you will, that could do just about anything. But at the same time, even if the phrases are understood, getting over that first hurdle that you have to design very differently to understand what's meant by one of these things, who is it or what is it that answers the questions underneath? And that's when you start to think about the validity of a general assistant that's able to do everything, and the concept that you're actually speaking to an assistant, not an app store necessarily. So you can't even choose at some point who's answering the question for you. And if you think about the notion of a general assistant, voice and this market is dominated by largely the perception that Alexa is voice, Google to an extent, which is more adopted in reality, and Siri even more so. I think 70% of people who have a phone speak to it every so often, even if they don't think they're doing it that much. But these assistants will never know everything. I think Alexa has 21 billion answers in its system at the minute, or thereabouts, the last time it was revealed. But it will never know everything, and it shouldn't. They should not have access to customer data that's not their own. Regulation actually gets in the way of them knowing some of these things that they would like to. So if you were to say one of these phrases from before, what's my bank balance? Alexa should have no access to your bank natively to understand that question. The answer actually has to come from your bank. Now, if you think about the mediation of that answer, that's one thing, that there's an assistant in the middle carrying that conversation, which in the real world, most of us probably wouldn't get into. You can't be 100% sure as a developer on the other side of the fence, the bank, what was said in the first place, because you're not always given the text, voice, recording, whatever it might be. You then have to create a layer of friction to enable that mediation to happen, which puts people off from adopting it in the first place. So users often have to remember a service name, brand, phrase, or something else cumbersome that gets in the way of non-general assistants actually being useful. But thankfully that world's starting to change. Amazon opened up a thing called the Interoperability Initiative 2 years ago, which started to open the notion that devices that are controlled by these tech companies could be accessed by third parties. So you would have direct access to the microphone, which is the holy grail of a voice service, or the raw phrase of a conversation if it was text. That then allows you to do things like being present on the hardware, so you could have a brand, even your bank name, which is the brand everybody knows, to talk directly to the users, and vice versa. Having a handoff from the general assistant, should it be amenable, to the other assistant that's best able to answer your question and not mediate it at all. That then lends yourself to having domain-specific capabilities, where you train your phrases to be 99% understood, not 95%, because you're really working with a subset that's much easier to research, train, and investigate. And effectively what you end up with is a private two-way channel with customers in their houses, which is again a holy grail for service, marketing and other things, and become the default provider for that particular customer conversation. The UK has led the world in this space through the BBC recently. So the BBC was first to really jump into this and say that they could create a domain-specific assistant for BBC's catalogue of content, which actually still took a year to do. So 2,000 hours of speech recordings to create a voice out the way, which was authentic for the BBC and not be the technology platform's voice and persona. An alpha phase testing phrases required to meet even the most basic things like playing a radio station or finding a podcast with 3,000 users, and you think the scale that entails. Conversation as a service architecture which sits on top of BBC services to make them discoverable by conversational means, with many entry points depending where you are in your particular mental model, journey and so on, and creating a whole new assistant brand identity to actually put it in people's heads so that they didn't have to ask the general assistant. So whilst it's doable, don't underestimate the whole nature of build it and they'll come, because even with all this, the beta's been a really hard thing to penetrate to the public and get them to adopt it. And even then, beyond all that, the BBC's had to meet public sector standards for information security, privacy, data and so on, which made it hard to do. But it's done and it's there, and the experience of 120 to 150 people that worked on this is in the market and looking for ways to exploit this type of technology properly. Myth number 3, voice is a new paradigm, start from scratch. Nonsense, I think. So if you decided that a balance request would be the thing to do, it would be fair to say as a bank you would have a route to offer that response in the first place, be it a web presence, an app. And if they are architected well in the first place, to kind of go against my very first myth, there should be a way to expose that to a voice service. So then really, to back up my original point, the thing you do is try to elicit the things people would say to ask for that. And you would respond very easily by mapping the intent that you found that the person wanted to the underlying function in your architecture that delivers a bank balance in a conversational method. That's a very simple way to take something that people might want and deliver it through something you already have. Don't overthink these things. It's an entry point to something people already do. And that's then really, if you think about it, how mobile took off. Mobile, as we say at Waracle, is the imperative in the digital development market without question, and it will be for some time to come, because mobile found its space through something called a mobile moment, meeting you at your point of need with what you needed, sometimes not even asking for it. It's no more complicated than that. Immediacy and context combined to set some very big expectations. You think about Uber had a need for people who wanted to get somewhere with people who needed passengers. And that immediacy, context and technology to underpin it, which mobile offered better than anything else before, created a whole new industry effectively out of one that was there. And that's now then been broadened and deepened. You could take the Uber model to food delivery as they're doing. It's no more different than I'm hungry and I have a delivery method and I have a takeaway offering stuff. So that's what people need to think about with voice. It's not building new things and finding the voice killer app, which many people are obsessed with. Apply it to things that are there and make them simpler to do because voice allows it to be so. Conversational moments will probably in the end be slightly different than the sort of things we talked about. So entry points to journeys that may have existed in the human world as opposed to the technology world. Uber is a very good illustration of that. But if you think about watching sport on TV, if you're in a bar, bless us when we're allowed to be back in them, or if you have friends in the house, even more so, you could be watching sport, you might turn to somebody next to you and say, has the referee done that before? Very simple phrase, it's in your head. Now TV in a transient way will pass you these facts now and again, but doesn't hold them for very long. You will easily miss them. Why don't you just ask the TV? Because that's the thing you're effectively working with in a journey to get what you want. So why not just shout at the TV? And it's up to the people who broadcast sport to provide the interface for things they already do. As I've said a couple of times already, why distract yourself with another device at that point? Because it's not naturally what you would want to do. Just a bit of a way to think about how these voice moments may come about. And then take it a step further. Myth number 4, conversation won't replace apps. I've said to you, mobile is the imperative. So again, this is a counterintuitive opinion even within this presentation. But have a think about it. If you look at the Internet Minute, which is on this slide just now, and all the things that are part of the average Internet Minute in the last year, most of the top 10 apps by downloads, and this has been consistent since about 2012, are communication apps of a different form or another, and primarily since then, messaging. So if you think about the usage of these things and how often we're in them, and you can look at the numbers in the internet wheel of a minute, most time is spent in these apps compared to any other thing we do. And then take it a step further, that in 2020 there's been a massive shift in people being willing to sit and talk to machines. Even if it's Zoom or Teams, the habits are starting to form quickly and people want to make them better. So you actually have a native interface to speak to a screen, a device, whatever. And actually, even the notion of an assistant with a specialist capability, be it something as simple as a timer, a calendar, a reminder, has been the difference between order and chaos for most of us that homeschool in the last year or so. And I've heard countless parents tell me that if it wasn't for an echo in the house, their kids wouldn't be doing anything. It's effectively the proxy teacher, if you like. And people already think in conversations. You only have to look at the most Googled things each year and how the phrases are constructed to understand how people approach needing to know something. So they don't type in, by and large, word, word, word. They type, I want thing. Why is thing happening? Why does something happen? And once you've got that, you can start to merge experiences across channels and start to defend yourself as a company offering service, which is where much of our economy actually resides, to meet and defend yourself against those most common queries and make sure people get the answers they were looking for quickly, because you can understand, using the principles I talked about earlier in the presentation, about how to get that intent and figure out what exactly they meant. People always tell me, having gone through all of this stuff, it sounds cumbersome, it's hard to do, it's just not really native as a development process to many of us, therefore it's not worth the time. But then you think about that. What I've just said 2 slides ago is that if you're in a service industry and you start to meet people with things they already think about in a way that's comfortable for them, you can start to reuse that technology across many channels. So if you look at it from one end, at the contact center, a well-known airline, and this is probably 5 years ago, parsed 330 million phrases used in its then voice call center, where it got permission to transcribe things, and its live chat platform, which was antiquated but did a job, found that really underneath people only asked 7 distinct questions. They offered 7 intents to use that language across any conversation. All conversations led to 7 answers effectively, which formed the basis of its first messenger bots and voice apps. And really, to give you an example of one of those, the number one thing was, I can't find my boarding pass, which is fairly easy to answer once you know what they actually meant, but there were thousands of ways people actually asked that. Skyscanner did it the other way round. I'm going to give some of my teammates who are in this call a bit of a check. Richard, Stefan and others used the beginnings of that, where we made a voice platform to meet about 5 different edge points in the world, be it Alexa, Cortana, Messenger, things like that, with one underlying service. Eventually we learned enough to turn that into the bones of a contact center and understand how to use this technology for a complementary and much bigger reason in the end, because that agile delivery of learning how to get an intent and all the different ways of finding how people ask for that intent had another use. We used the data to go in a circular manner to build customer service from scratch. And in the last year, that's even more important, because people are juggling things in many different ways because of this new interaction with faces on Zoom all day that many of us have to do. People start to prove that they can work asynchronously, so they juggle different kinds of conversation. Conversation isn't necessarily a linear thing anymore, where you start and end a particular journey. You may start with one, move to another, come back, and actually the platform lends itself very well to that. And if you think again about mobile being the imperative, people need to think more about leaning on that now and again, if you're conducting a conversation on your phone, be it in some conversational platform, why not use the means within that phone to authenticate yourself if you have to, and just do it in front of the screen you're on and take some of that friction out, as opposed to trying to make everything cram into a smart speaker and move somebody away from it. You actually start to think that this conversational world has an application on devices that people use day to day anyway. And on the other side, agents in conversational tech have proved they can handle between 5 and 8 conversations at a time, where in the past one voice call or one live chat session, because they were constructed in much the same way, are essentially one-to-one until they're complete. But people, because you understand, they don't instantly want to finish something they're doing. They come back and forth between voice services. They think about what to do next. You can make a virtue of that and have people handle many service conversations at the same time by understanding the journey and trying to really make sure you ask them the next question. So when they do come back, they don't have to come back very often. And even a layer above that, speech and emotion detection can give you a picture of the customer and service agent in real time. So not just are the customers getting what they want, are the agents getting too angry? Are they needing a break and take them out of the system for a while? These things are actually starting to spin the wheels of customer service in many different ways that you may not have thought about. And then the last one, myth number 6, given all of those things, and I've told you some ways that it can be thought about, many people still say to me, and have said for a good 5 years working in this stuff, it's too hard to predict. I mean, web is fairly predictable. You know what to do. Mobile, to a degree, it still emerges, but there are well-known principles that work in mobile now and have been established over the years. They've not happened with voice yet, but I think it's not hard to predict and find some patterns that you can rely on. And essentially it's about sticking to the basics. So conversational products need to bear a few very simple things in mind that you would think naturally if you were conversing with somebody yourself. Is there any value to the conversation you're having, and can it be delivered quickly in a conversational form? Call that V, and we're going to apply this to a formula in a second, which we do believe actually carries some weight in predicting how these things unfold. Contexts. Will the service work across different contexts? Can it be spoken and typed successfully as opposed to some other method? Friction. Is the question hard to ask? So hard that you can't instantly get what people mean from it or understand the words of it? Complexity. Does the question have too many variables which get confused? So think of travel, how many different places and airports and so on there might be within a fairly simple phrase like I need a flight to X. And is the thing you're doing frequent enough to be used often enough to be worthwhile? So are you going to do this thing often enough that it's worth going back to and memorable, that people are going to keep using it and get what they want from it with all the above in mind? So these things, V, C1, C2, F1 and F2, abstract as that might seem, are 6 rules if you take each one on a scale of 1 to 10 and run the formula where it's essentially value multiplied by the contexts of it divided by the complexity and friction multiplied by the frequency to be used will virtually guarantee the success of a service. I saw this working inside Amazon and applied it to existing real life data to prove this point, and it absolutely stood out. So if you think about these things, you will more likely succeed up to a maximum score of 1,000 if you work what you're going to do through that formula. There's a much longer way to do this, but we'll stick to a basic 3 examples to try and explain what I mean. And these are consumer facing, but you could apply this to just about anything that uses a conversational pattern. First one, BBC Sounds, which is the most used service by a country mile on smart speakers in the UK. Sample phrase, play Radio 2, you know what you're doing there. Now, that's simple because it is. It's a short phrase, the brands are well understood, you know what you want. It's convenient because you're essentially turning something that was a hand-dialed device 30 years ago to something you can talk to, and apparently, given frequency and convenience, people do switch the radio on and off 5 to 6 times a day on average when they adopt this as their primary entry point. The contextual part is easy because it works in houses, it works in cars, it works in offices, because the phrases are short enough that things shouldn't get in the way of them being understood. And even then, I'm being harsh on it, but that scores 500 out of 1,000. I'd be happy to break that down separately another time. Get me to sleep, which is probably the second biggest use case. Third, maybe after music and light bulbs on smart speakers. Certainly the most used of the developer products. It's simple because you're saying what you want to do. It offers you background noise to help you get to sleep effectively. It's convenient because it's a simple thing when you're in your bed. Potentially the bedside clock is getting you to sleep. It's frequent because you may use that more than once a day. Certainly every day if that's what you want. It's valuable because it improves your health and well-being. There's no dispute about that. And yet I'm giving that 600 out of 1,000. There is still improvement in it, and the developer is doing very well improving it and has done for 5 years. He's the primary developer of these things. And then one that I worked on with some people who will be listening into this and remember it. So Get Me a Flight as a voice service is complex because it takes you many steps to get what people want, and even then there are complexities inside the phrases that make them hard to parse. So places, dates and variations that people just say strange things in terms of flight conversations. It's open-ended because theoretically the price may not suit you and you could be there for minutes on end like you would be in a call. So it's not actually any better than sitting in front of a web page sometimes. It's infrequent because people use it 4 times a year on average when they look for flights. And it's actually slower than using an app, and we proved this, that when we initially thought of it at Skyscanner, we thought 45 taps on a screen has to be less convenient than just saying what's in your head, but turns out it wasn't. So people didn't actually get themselves across, the system couldn't understand them, and therefore tapping across a screen, something they're fairly used to, didn't suit. So if I had my life again, I wouldn't do that the way we did. We'd do something very different and a bit more immediate and informational about travel, and that then scores 1.5 out of 1,000, which tells you that the ends of things and where to start placing your bets on a conversational service. Stick to information and stick to convenient, simple, frequent things, and you'll be on to a winner. Thank you for listening. I'm sure there'll be questions. I'm sure there's been some while I've been talking, and I'd be happy to take some more for the next half hour. It's been a pleasure, and thanks again for your time.
Thanks, David, who joins us now from Perth in Scotland, rather than the Perth that I thought of when you first said Perth. Thanks for joining us, David. Some great stuff there. I'm going to be honest. I have an Echo, and it's used to turn the lights on and off. And I sort of, I think Yo-Yo said in the chat as well, like she's using it for turning lights on and off and asking for the time and setting kitchen timers. If I use my Siri for kitchen timers, is it really just the case that that's all people are using it for, or is there a sort of long tail of people who are getting way more value out of their voice assistants than I am, for example?
I mean, the figures are never made that public, but I mean, with these things, what you've said is useful enough. And at the very end of the presentation, I tried to be clear that there are certain things that have very high value. Whether it's the ease of just, if you're in a call at home and turning the music off when the phone rings and stuff like that is actually very useful, and it has a place. But there is a much longer tail of stuff coming through that has many thousands of users. It's just not many millions yet. I think that's the way to paint it. I think Brian from Boston said in the chat his skills into several thousands of users, and it's taken a while to get there, but it's building up slowly over time. So the long tail's getting there, but it is pretty long.
What do you think will be the sort of tipping point? What is there a set of preconditions where that's likely to kind of, like, is it a technology thing? Is it our ability to understand language better in the digital domain that's going to kind of drive that, or is something else at play?
I'm going to be honest. There's a way that things generally work with, I'll say Amazon to start with, but the other assistants go down the same path. The platforms will pick their winners somehow. So if there's a service that people are going to want, then there'll be phrases people are using now to ask for it, and it's up to the platform to join these things together. It goes on to a degree just now. So if you were to say, and I'm going to use the same example I always use, forgive me for this, if you ask Alexa to fart, it always directs that command to one particular service underneath that gets lots of traffic as a result. And that's been a join made deliberately by Amazon to get people to something that works. Now, as more phrases get spotted that many people are asking for, the platform will direct them to the best service underneath. Now, if you think about that in Amazon terms, as something like the buy box, the one-click box on the website, there will be a skill that eventually exists for most things people ask for. And that then possibly shuts certain developers out, potentially. And there's ways that, as in the Amazon marketplace, people get their skills, their products surfaced through an algorithm or something like that. That's the way it's going to happen. There's no other way for users to get to 100,000 skills underneath manually through app stores or anything like that, because it all starts with phrases in people's heads. So it's up to the platform to route from what people are thinking to the most likely thing or the most useful thing that answers it.
Yeah. Is there a commercial kind of story here as well where it's like asking the... I'm not going to say the word out loud because my Echo is on a shelf and I couldn't reach it to mute it. But asking for a fart noise, right? That sort of links up to a skill that plays a fart sound, but there's no... that the author of that skill has no idea who you are. There's no monetization opportunity. Like, is this just capitalism kind of preventing kind of stuff from doing better, I guess?
Well, in that case, Amazon and other platforms do it too. Just not to talk about Amazon all the way through this. They have ways of rewarding people for doing things. So, for example, something like the fart skill, which became very popular, the developer is rewarded for keeping people busy on the device. And there's a way that's done underneath that the more traffic you generate, the more sticky the skill is, which probably isn't the thing to say about a fart one. Then you get paid more for keeping that skill alive, essentially. And there's a pot that's shared between developers every month. That's one way. There are other services that are paid on platforms, Google and Amazon the same. You maybe play a quiz and you get the first 10 questions for free, or the first 10 rounds or whatever, and you pay to get more, and it becomes more enjoyable. And again, there's ways the platforms incentivize that. So Prime users get it free, others pay, and things like that. But it's really keeping people attached to the devices at the end of the day, which is what the platforms want.
Yeah. I think the other thing I struggled with my setup, I run a home automation system for just very trivial stuff. I don't really have a lot of bits and pieces, but even I, as a apparent expert who can wrangle firewalls and write bits of Python and all that kind of stuff, found it difficult to actually glue those things together and sort of add voice capability to that home system, and it's sort of, I don't know, it feels like it defies tinkering in a way that that other parts of the AWS platform don't. But maybe that's because I haven't invested as much time into that as I have in other parts of the platform.
It does lend itself heavily to going with things that work off the shelf very well. And I think that lends itself to a company like Amazon being able to sell approved light bulbs that do work very well. I mean, in the early days of the service, you could buy light bulbs from IKEA, for example, and they actually went through a well-architected process, to go back to the first talk tonight, to make sure when you asked for a light bulb to be switched on, it didn't take 5-10 seconds, because that's just ridiculous compared to a switch. But that got fixed and down to milliseconds eventually. So it's better to go with the things that work reliably, and they're badged to work reliably. But if you look at the spread of different platforms, I think I'm right in saying that HomeKit is by far the most reliable, fastest service, but there's very few things work with it. And there's probably a lesson in that you can buy tons of things from Amazon that will work with an Alexa scale that's been cobbled together, but there's millions of devices made in sort of generic factories and stuff that do that. Apple work with a very small set and make them work very well. So you pays your money and takes your choice.
Which I suppose is the Apple philosophy all over, really, isn't it? The kind of,
exactly. And Google's somewhere in the middle. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's a bit Wild West sometimes with Alexa devices, because they are really easy to make and set up, but
less easy to run securely, I suppose.
That's been known as well. But again, what the badging service that Amazon runs to approve certain smart home things is meant to get around that. So it's very well flagged in the store of what you're buying and why.
Yeah. So I mean, you were on the inside at Amazon in this team. I don't know how much you're allowed to share about that. I'm kind of interested in I guess, like, what was the remit of that team, and what were the things that were particularly interesting that you were able to kind of get stuck into there from an engineering perspective?
So the solutions architecture team at Amazon, and I had a while as the lead evangelist for Europe as well for my sins. That team is essentially the team that helps outsiders build things against the platform. So similar to a TAM in AWS, you were there to be the specialist to make sure things got done well, but to also help people to understand what to build, which is where that magic formula came from at the end of the presentation, because we actually started using that to figure out if people's crackpot ideas were going to work. But you were there to try and find use cases that were really going to make the platform showcase itself. And we got involved in helping companies up to a point to build them. Sort of good examples I could quote were things like Virgin Trains, for example, which was an early one that wanted to do voice booking, which I got my fingers burnt working at Skyscanner trying to do something similar with flights. But Virgin Trains felt that having looked at their customer journey, they could get that down in time from an average of minutes to about a third of the minutes by going from an app-based service to a voice one, because the journeys that people asked for were common, the phrases were easy to understand, they limited the number of stations they used, but then they bolted on Amazon Pay, which with a very simple layer of permissions made it easy to buy the tickets. So I think that got from something like 7 minutes average to find and buy a ticket on Virgin's own website to under 2 minutes doing it through the voice skill, most of which was the card fulfillment and things like that. So there were some very good ideas like that started with, how do we make this better? And we helped them figure out the best way to do it, whether that was understanding station names better and helping Amazon machine learning team to process that data more quickly and things like that. So really hand-holding customers, but really for the benefit of Echo users to give them more things to do.
Right, yeah. I have to say I was a regular user of Virgin Trains when we were able to travel places, and also an owner of an Echo and a sort of avid fan of Amazon stuff. I didn't know you could do that. But also, I don't know whether I would want to. That when you were talking about booking flights, I mean, it's difficult enough trying to sort of wrangle the flight booking and make sure you've got it on the right dates and everything when you can see it on a screen. Never mind kind of a sort of voice in your ear. And I wonder whether there's an opportunity here for systems that are a bit more hybrid, where you have a visual aid and you're also navigating with voice, which is a bit more sci-fi, right? That's the Blade Runner thing, kind of zoom in, enhance kind of stuff. I'm surprised not to have seen that so much, although I do turn Siri off every time I upgrade my Mac, because I'm just not interested in using it. So maybe I'm acting against my interests there.
Yeah, I think that there's different horses for courses. On the Mac series, a very good assistive technology. So if you need assistance to use the computer, then it's a very good interface to do that. So it's there for a reason. Those that need it, it's not really taken off as a consumer thing quite as much, but it's there and it's there to be built on. But for other services, I mean, things like booking trains, when you actually peel it back to I'm a product guy at heart for building things. If you peel it back to what people need, a lot of train tickets people buy are repetitive, and it's
Yeah.
either something they bought last week, last month, or renewing a season ticket or something that's very simple. And if it's hooked up to a fulfillment system, you get an email with your ticket and a QR code, job done. I mean, that's 2 minutes actually seems quite a long time when you think about it that way. In flights, it was far too complicated. There's too many variations. But if you'd taken that back to something like does airline fly from here to there, that's much simpler, and it gives you what you want without waiting for it. So there would have been a better thing to do. And I think setting up things like price alerts was a much easier system, which wasn't allowable on voice platforms at the time, but it is now. So we could have done more with Skyscanner. It was 5 years ago, so we didn't. But there are many more simple things you can do with voice than that.
Yeah, interesting stuff. So, what's your I don't know, prediction for the next 5 years? What should we be looking out for in that market, that sort of problem domain?
I was asked this at the turn of the year. I really do think that the voice industry will fragment a bit more, which seems like a scary thing to people. But ultimately, that point I was trying to make, that domain speciality is the key here. That if the main platforms and the developers aren't doing the things that people really want, for example, banking for one, which I think will come, then it's really up to technology to allow these companies to do it themselves. And the more you specialize in something, there's a much higher chance of it working properly. So the original example that always used to be quoted in our team was Capital One in the States built a service to give you your balance. It took 700 phrases to get that to work. 700 variations of what's my balance, believe it or not. And that's true. But having done that and learned from it, it's not, once you're in the process, you can add more. So I think domain specialism, like the BBC's done with its service, you can understand what people are asking for much more easily and more quickly than the platform would spread itself across all these different use cases. So domain assistants that hand off to each other and hand off to the one that can answer the question best should be the future. It's something that all the platforms are looking at. You'll find, I think, in time, Echoes will be able to answer maybe 10 to 12 major domain assistants that do the particular things they offer, and that's where it's going to go. It'll take a bit longer yet, but then things become much more useful, and brands can expose themselves a bit more than you do today. That's where it's going to go, I'm sure, because that's where the technology has all gone underneath in the last couple of years.
Yeah, good stuff. Final bonus question. Your company's called Waracle. That sounds an awful lot like a big database / cloud vendor. Is that intentional? Where's that from?
I couldn't possibly comment. I believe it's originally, I'm fairly new to the company, so it's originally to do with gaming and the gaming world, but whether it's got any connection besides that to databases and stuff, I couldn't possibly see.
Fair enough. Well, thanks for joining us tonight, David. Just some really good insight.
You're welcome.
I certainly hadn't considered voice in the level of detail that you obviously have, and it's interesting to share. And like to see people in the chat appreciate that as well. So thanks very much. Do stick around and chat in the Twitch chat a little more if you like. And
welcome. I will do. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Cheers.
Cheers.